Now turn to Section 3. Section 3. You will hear a student Eric talking to his lecturer, Mrs. Harris, about some study difficulties. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 25. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 25.
Hi, Mrs. Harris. I really liked your lecture, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Glad it was interesting. So, how can I help you?
Well, why do you think I need help?
You just don't look too happy.
I admit I'm having some difficulties.
About what?
Oh, it's hard to say exactly. All the reading is quite a chore, but I'm handling it. What really wears me down are the assignments.
The reading load is just part of the course, but sure, the assignments take more time, more effort.
And you know how you have to use what you read in your assignments?
That's right. That's the point of the readings.
Well, the reading passages also seem, well...
Boring?
No, not boring, but it's hard to connect it all, to remember what the readings are about, if you know what I mean.
Well, I'd advise you to write a small summary at the back of each reading text.
Really?
Absolutely. Basically, you don't want to be going through these texts again and again, and you'll need to refer to them often. So write a small summary, and when you revisit these texts, just read these.
I'm not too sure how to write a summary, though.
It's easy enough. The important thing is to check that you've written the main point and not just a list of details in order of their appearance. Details are not what matters, so again, don't make a list of these. That will just waste valuable time, and you're going to get very busy soon enough. Usually these articles argue a point, or otherwise have a certain purpose, so think all the time, what's the point and what's the purpose?
OK, and just write that?
Not just that. You have to think about the supporting points also. Then you might wish to cite some evidence. You can decide that yourself. But what's the most important thing about a summary?
That it's accurate?
No, that it's short. After all, it's a summary, right? So, main point, supporting point, some evidence, and most importantly, keep it short, OK?
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 26 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 26 to 30.
Well, those points about writing summaries sound useful, but what about the actual formatting of the summary? On paper, I mean. Are there any other points I should know about?
Yes, there's a lot actually. It's very important to...
Write clearly?
Write the author's name.
But the author's name is in the text anyway.
But it must also be in your summary. And you must always lead with this. For example, Peter Brown argues that, and so on.
So the author's name is Peter Brown?
Yes, and the actual summary continues from there. And here's another good hint. Always write the citation details at the top using bullet points. This makes these details clearer and easier to see, and immediately means you're not plagiarizing the text. You are acknowledging the source, which is academic and required. This also allows you to quickly write these details down later if you paraphrase or quote from either the summary or the original text.
What details go in the citation?
The year of publication is obviously important, but here's another tip. Make sure whatever you're reading is not more than 10 years old. Anything older than that is considered too dated, since business theory moves on fairly quickly. You can cite older texts, but only under special conditions.
What are they?
Well, if the text is a very well-known book, a classic of its kind, but then you have to indicate that in your writing, acknowledge that the book is dated, but then give a justification about why you nevertheless felt the need to use it.
I see.
So you'll have a lot of summaries for all the texts, but with such clear formatting you'll be able to access information quickly. But make sure you store these pages in an order, of course, alphabetical. based on the author's family names is the simplest method.
Or in order of date, chronological order?
That's possible too, but I'd say alphabetical is always the best.
My friends say chronological order has more advantages.
Any system is fine, provided that it's logical and that you can follow it and quickly access your summaries at a later date.
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers.